It was 5 years ago today, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, the formal beginning of an era of isolation, uncertainty, and real fear you likely remember all too well. More than 7 billion lives were lost globally, including more than 1.2 million Americans. And while the mask mandates, vaccine cards, and the eerily empty city streets are gone, many aspects of the pandemic never really left us. Our next guest argues that COVID remade the United States into the country we live in today. David Wallace Wells is the author of The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming, and opinion writer and columnist at the New York Times. I was telling you my entire team was riveted by this article, and I want to start with the economy because we're talking about it so much today. Fundamentals, things like GDP growth, wages, unemployment, used to be a pretty good predictor, right, of how Americans felt about the economy. But how much are we still dealing financially and reactively to what we all live through?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a big gap that opened up between what the fundamentals suggested and what people felt was the state of the economy in the pandemic. There are a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is that what we started to call the vibes were pretty dark, not just because maybe people were struggling to keep up with their bills, but also because they were observing mass illness, hospitalization, and death around them, and because they had been pushed into a state of turmoil that even for those people who survived the pandemic and were never really threatened by serious illness, their lives were disrupted too. So we've been through a world historical trauma, a generational trauma, and yet we're so eager to get back to normal that we almost avoid looking at it. We're living in a state of some kind of denial, when the pandemic is at least a partial explanation for, I think, quite a lot of the transformations of the last few years.
Let's talk about a couple of them specifically. There's a new Axios Ipsos poll that found a sharp partisan divide, for example, in how Americans view our public health institutions. Just 40% of Republicans trust the National Institutes of Health compared to 77% of Democrats. Similar numbers for the CDC. How did COVID change that and what we perceive as science and reality?
Well, I think, the public health officials were not perfect through the pandemic. They made some mistakes. They advised against masking at first, and they advised for masking. They kind of overpromised at some points about the vaccines. They did some work to suppress conversation about lab leak. I think all of those were mistakes. But when I think about a disease that killed 1 million Americans and made so many more of us so much sicker, those seem like relatively small mistakes. And they got many of the big things right. In fact, many of the people at the outset who were predicting a death toll of even 100,000 or 200,000 were called hysterical.
Yeah, we thought that was crazy, or so many people did.
And it turned out that that was an undercount,
yep.
Right? I think the main reason why so many people have turned against public health is not because they actually failed in protecting us. It's because we want to pretend that the disease was not that scary. We want to actually push off all of those feelings of vulnerability and fear that we had in 2020, pretend that we didn't need to feel that way. And if we tell ourselves that the pandemic, our experience of the pandemic, was the result of officials and their mistakes as opposed to our biological and social vulnerability, then it allows us to believe, first of all, that next time we won't have to go through the same things again. And secondly, it allows us to pin blame for all of that suffering we experienced on someone in particular, rather than accepting it as a fact of human nature.
So we're at 5 years now. But let's project down the road. I think about the generation of children who had years of their education and their social information, right, their socializing, interrupted by the pandemic, many of them by themselves, essentially. Do we have a handle on what this has meant to them and what it might mean going forward?
Well, first, for me, I start from the global perspective and see that we see a huge anti-incumbency wave globally, politically. We see a right-wing turn among young people, especially young men, almost everywhere in the world, anti-institutionalist, anti-establishmentarian. I worry that that's with us to stay. Some of the more direct consequences, I think, have actually been somewhat overstated with kids. Pandemic learning loss was real, but it was in league with the other countries of the world, many of whom closed their schools for shorter. We didn't see a spike in teen suicide. We have seen some signs of increasing mental distress. But I think it's in that turn away from institutions and away from social trust that we're going to see the real lingering effects among America's youth.
The right swing?
Yes, exactly.
David Wallace Wells, I wish we had more time to talk, but I recommend the article to everyone. It is a brilliant piece of work, and we thank you for coming on to talk about it.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.